IIT-B, we'd now like to call on Leader Octo.
This is two things that are in your position. Firstly, I'm going to explain to you why Glasgow will be completely ineffective in actually convincing the Japanese public of anything, and why that creates worse harms in regards to Japan's international relations. Then we're going to tell you why, even if they were successful in projecting this narrative, why that harms. So, what do we support on your position? We support a moderate path the Japanese public can actually follow. We think that involves things like shaming individual war criminals. We're happy to say that we're not a fan of visiting the Yasukuni Shrine, or things that actually inflame tensions. We want nuance this conflict to be appreciated and others playing on both sides. What we think that they support was an attack on the war itself, in a way that made Japan as a whole and every individual person in Japan responsible. We thought of that conflict directly in nationalist narratives, that's why it's not going to work. So, one quick piece of rebuttal doesn't fit into the rest of my speech. We hear from Glasgow that the status quo in Japan cannot project forward because because traditional partners hate it too much. So obviously the first response is this is contingent on them actually improving the way Japan's traditional partners see Japan. We're going to show you why that's not true. But putting that aside, we've got two additional responses. Firstly, it misunderstood the actual nature of the enmity between Japan and China and other countries, which we think involves a centuries or millennial-long conflict that is based on racial tensions, that is based on historical tensions. We think those things go much deeper than World War II, which is just the most approximate cause. But secondly, we didn't even understand why it was a good thing for Japan to project force. We thought that what that probably looked like was Japan taking a more aggressive posture towards China, which probably just inflamed the risk of conflict in the region more broadly. Okay, first the standard point. Why did this create a giant backlash that meant that it was never going to be effective for convincing the Japanese public? Because like Garden told you in POI, what really mattered in this debate was not the attitudes that the government had, but the attitudes that were embedded within the Japanese public conscience. We have 5 reasons why they're not going to be able to penetrate that. Firstly, from a purely rational basis, the people in Japan are aware of the fact that soldiers are being blamed for something that they are actually just not responsible for. Because the people in that conflict were indoctrinated in a way the Japanese people understand. Because they were under orders in many cases. If they failed to fulfill those orders, they would be given the death penalty. And furthermore, they weren't even committing war crimes. They were doing things that would generally be seen as morally equivalent to what every other side in that conflict or in any other conflict would have been. So even if the Japanese people weren't nationalists at all, we still think they would be fucking pissed off by this model. Secondly, we think that this represents victim's justice, because it says that the Japanese people have to attack their own identity and their own souls in a way that the United States doesn't under Glasgow's model, which means that this will look profoundly unfair, because it is profoundly unfair. Because you guys were blaming Japanese soldiers for things that American soldiers and British soldiers and Chinese soldiers were doing as well. Thirdly, because in all countries, in particular Japan, they have a very strong narrative about fallen soldiers. There's an idea that these soldiers have sacrificed themselves for a greater good for that national identity, and that narrative is deeply ingrained and don't need to dislodge it just by attacking it. Fourthly, because as I implied in my introduction, this is an attack on Japan itself, because you don't distinguish between any kind of individual actions. You just attack the entire country, which means that it conflicts directly with everything about Japanese nationalism. Fifthly, because it fails to distinguish between crimes of the individual and crimes of the nation. So what does this backlash look like in practice? It looks like actors outside the government visiting the ashes of the Yasukuni Shrine. It looks like public intellectuals promoting active historical revisionism to try and paper over the crimes of Japan previously. It involves an active increase in the amount of jingoism against China and an active increase in the amount of attacks on this particular position. It involves opposition politicians coming out and saying that they don't support this particular policy and saying that the government should be ashamed that they would have pursued it. Why is that so harmful? Because it encourages all other actors to increase jingoism, and crucially, because this backlash is visible to all other actors. Because Chinese people in the Chinese government can see the way Japan really feels about the war. They can see this backlash and they can use that to shape their attitudes. Thirdly, because you presumably can't bind future Japanese governments to pursue the same sorts of policies, which means when you ingrain these jingoistic attitudes, that is then reflected in the policies of future Japanese governments. Fourthly, because when you encourage the Japanese government to pursue a policy that will never be seen as legitimate, you reduce its future ability to change the national narrative by making it appear like a morally illegitimate institution to ordinary Japanese people. The only preemptive response we've heard from Glasgow about this is that attitudes can change because of the government changes. We thought that there were too many narratives at stake here that they came into conflict with, and there were too many other actors. But then they said the real issue here is that these people no longer look like they represent the whole of Japan. A couple of problems with that. Firstly, they will represent the whole of Japan, because all of these things are so deeply ingrained that most Japanese people will probably buy into our idea. Even if it's not all Japanese people, it will be enough that they will look representative, at least to themselves. So we don't think it's true that you isolate people at all. In fact, you encourage them to have a larger voice in society. Okay, second point of substandard. Even if you do get this narrative out into public consciousness, why is it still bad? Before I do, Canterbury.
If Japanese nationalism is so ingrained in popular culture, why was the Emperor Hirohito able to reject nationalism, to reject militarism, and therefore get the Japanese people to buy into the post-war occupation?
Okay, so we completely reject that historical narrative. What actually happened at the end of World War II was that the Americans co-opted Japanese nationalism by putting a new emperor who they thought that the ordinary Japanese people could buy into. That's why Japan still has an emperor, because the United States after World War II respected Japanese people enough that they weren't going to humiliate them by getting rid of their royal family. They understood the important symbol that the emperor had. Okay, so first reason why this is a really bad narrative, because it creates a completely unnuanced understanding of war in general and the Pacific War in particular, because you're painting Japan as just universally evil, with no understanding of the way in which that evil occurs on both sides. There are cases being made to the Japanese people, but the Americans also feel guilty about that war. You tell people that that war is just morally similar. Why is that particularly problematic? Because it makes people susceptible to similar narratives about other conflicts. Specifically, we think all this is going to make Chinese people believe that it's okay to confront China in a jingoistic way. So the same idea that you can paint war in terms of simple good and evil narratives will apply to China as well. Secondly, because it creates the idea of collective responsibility, just like Glasgow said, that everyone is responsible, not because of anything they did or anything they chose to do, but simply because they're Japanese. The idea that in Atlantic discourse, that the collective responsibility is an okay thing to have in a society, and then you turn around on Chinese and Korean people as well. You can make them collectively responsible for the harms that you feel they have committed on Japan in the past. We think that's actually unjust. We think that it inflames jingoism by making you think that simply because they are Korean, they're responsible for whatever it is that the North Korean government does. Simply because they're Chinese, they're responsible for boycotts or attempts to annex the Senkaku Islands. Then Glasgow says that it's fine because these people don't consider themselves as individuals. A couple of responses. Firstly, considering yourself to be collectively responsible doesn't actually mean you are collectively responsible. And secondly, people in Japan currently are exposed to the individualist liberal narratives that like Western trade has given them, which is that grain of individualism still exists to the point where it's something that we should preserve on our side of the house, and you guys actively come into conflict with. Just to speak, this was a model that was supposedly ineffective, but even if it was ineffective, it still led to worse concepts about war. We're so happy with those.